the social services, the housing development, et cetera. So I really wanted to look at this to see how these different organizations that play several different roles, from social services provider to developer to educator to convener to organizer, how they manage that in the engagement space and engagement, considering the conflicting agendas that come with the funding and their mission. So this work makes two main contributions to literature. I provide empirical data to support a framework that I created called the Mountain of Citizen Power, as well as the Citizen Power Score, which is connected to the mountain. And this adds to the civic studies literature, as well as the community development literature and the nonprofit capacity literature. So before we go any further, I want to tell you about my home city, Newark, New Jersey. We are the largest city in the state of New Jersey. We're about 10 miles away from Lower Manhattan. We are a very multi-ethnic, multi-language, multiracial city. 50%, about 50% of us are Black or African American, 30-something%, 37 growing, identify as Hispanic, Latina. We have 37% foreign born. 50% of Newarkers speak another language other than English at home, just giving you an understanding of the city that I live in. We about 24 square miles. I meant to convert that into kilometers, but that slipped, my apologies. Very low owner-occupied housing rate at less than 24%. Our high school graduation rate is less than the state average at 77%. The state average, I think, closer to 88 or 87. 24% of people in poverty, with children in poverty at 32%. In terms of voter turnout, one of probably the most popular measures of engagement or civic participation, 49%, and that number is even lower when you look at off-cycle elections like local elections, school boards, et cetera. Those numbers are in the single digits. So what is community development? So in the literature, there are different perspectives. There's the economic lens, the social lens, political. My favorite probably is the economic lens. It's the response to communities that have suffered from capital disinvestment. It's where the government and the private sector cannot meet the needs of local community members. Community development sector steps in to create programs, projects, housing, et cetera. And it covers many different topics: social economic development, capacity building, all the things, parks, schools. Community development produces assets that improve the quality of life. So this social lens is actually speaking to the quality of life, how people live on a day-to-day. So community development is really addressing that. From a political sense, which this project is based heavily on, the Arnstien definition, community development is about power and control. So who sets the agenda for how a community develops, whether that's socially, economically, politically, et cetera. So the other term that's important that I'll be speaking about today is nonprofit capacity. What is it? It's a multidimensional concept, and it speaks to the strengths or the muscles that a nonprofit has to carry out their mission. And this framework has 5 different pegs or 5 different areas: resource capacity, having to do with their funding, how large the money that they bring in, their ability to raise money; programmatic, which is the breadth of programs that they're able to do to reach their mission; organizational, which has to do with their staff capacity and their board capacity and other things on the organizational level; network capacity, and that has to do with their ability to connect with their community and other organizations, both that are doing the work that they do, but also adjacent industries or adjacent topics. And then political capacity, a nonprofit's ability to connect with local politicians, folks in government, whether it's civil service or electeds. And then finally, what's engagement, participation? I use them in this study interchangeably, and when you look at the literature, a lot of folks do that as well. There are some scholars that say that there's definitional slippage if we use them interchangeably, but I'd say as many that say that also say that they're basically one and the same, and it depends on the person or the positionality of where the definition is coming from. So some perspectives in the literature: individual versus organizational. So you think about voter blocks, or how people as in a mass votes, that would sort of be a macro or even a political perspective of engagement or participation. Whereas a lot of literature look at what makes one person more likely to participate than another. This study is looking at participation as it relates to organizations, specifically nonprofit organizations. And the reason I chose that was because I've been in the community development sector in low-income communities in New Jersey, and that's been my framework, my point of view. I realized that there isn't much area of capacity in these communities where folks can come together and get things done. There are hospitals, there are schools, and there are units of government, and none of those are really suited to have people organize and connect and be together. But then there are nonprofits, and the nonprofits really, I think, are our best bet in our neighborhoods that that are looking to mobilize and organize and shift the tides. The ladder of citizen participation, landmark work by Sherry Arnstien in the 60s. She defined participation as power. It's a categorical term for power, she said. And it's a relationship between the haves and the have-nots. There are the haves that have power and the have-nots who basically get either, I want to say, pushed around by the haves, or they end up actually being given real power. So on the low end of the ladder, she calls non-participation. There's therapy and manipulation. The middle rungs are placation, consultation, and informing, and partnership, delegated power, and decision control on the top. And her argument here is that when folks come to the table under the guise of, let's talk about what you want in your community, there are different angles that the leaders or the organizers can take. Many of them might actually just be blowing smoke, and they don't really care what you have to say. And that form would be manipulation or therapy. Some are just informing you one directional, right? Telling you what's happening and not really expecting you to come back with any feedback. And then all the way to the top, citizen control, where individuals or communities actually have the ability to make decisions and inform, more than inform, but actually be part of agenda setting and implementation. But there are limitations to this ladder. It's linear, it's one-dimensional. It doesn't account for different participation purposes and arenas. She was doing it in the 60s, where there were really a lot of dubious people that didn't care about Black and brown people, and they wanted to just appease the process and say, hey, we're here, let me listen to you, let me keep it moving. And she was pointing those people out like, hey, nice try. You think you're doing participation, you're telling people that, but that's not really what's happening. You're just, manipulating them, or this is just therapy, or you're informing them. And she really wanted to make that point. The other limitation here is the ladder. Because of this, because of her time and her perspective and her positionality, it creates a narrative of good actors and bad actors, right? Those that engage on the top level of the ladder are really the ones that are really trying to help, and the ones at the bottom are the ones that are trying to maintain the status quo. And I found that in the study that I was working on, that really didn't work. That wasn't the narrative. That wasn't the story. Nonprofits were not so nefarious in their actions. They weren't trying to maintain a status quo. They actually really wanted to have individuals come in and be part of decision-making processes and the work that they were doing to rebuild the community. So a little bit about my research methods and study design. I conducted a cross-sectional mixed methods city case study. I had 11 organizations. The age range is about 3 to 105 years old. Number of people served annually from as small as 250 to 84,000. Budget range 545 to 69. I'm trying to move this thing out of the way. I don't know why. Oh, it's gone. Oh, it's back. Yeah, it's not even coming up here.
Yeah, like on the box itself.
It goes underneath.
Is it the little flat line?
No, it goes underneath.
Oh, it just goes. Oh, you're.
Yeah, it's okay. I can read it from here. And then the other parts that are blocked is the executive tenure and the organizer tenure. So what I ended up doing was interviewing executive directors or senior level staff and the community organizers or an equivalent type of position at the organizations. 18 interviews, 22 people, 30 minutes to 120. These were all virtual. Another reason why I didn't pursue a Pretoria case study. I knew I actually had to be here, meet people, see the space, because I wasn't familiar. In Newark, I had been working in the sector, so the folks already knew me. Doing Zoom interviews during COVID, was welcomed in a lot of places. Some places, some interviews felt a lot like therapy and folks just venting and talking about the work because of the times we were in. I use inductive and deductive coding, and then cross-tabulation analysis, which I'll go over, which I will talk about later. So the first question, why do community development nonprofits engage people in their work? And I thought that I would be able to plug in their whys on Sherry Arnstein's ladder, and it didn't work. Because the first of all, they gave about 9 different reasons. Sherry's Arnstein's ladder has 8 rungs, and they didn't, and their work, their engagement reasons were more intentions in terms of what they were trying to achieve. And they gave me 9 reasons: information sharing, social, to share information, to provide social services, to build individuals' capacity, to advocate for them, or to help them, show them how to advocate for themselves in the different arenas that they work in, for political participation, to build relationships, to organize and mobilize them, for economic sovereignty, and for direct control. And I have some quotes on the right, an example of the economic sovereignty. A couple of my home buyers, let's put it this way, they were struggling with their credit and they start working with us and now they own homes. We don't want residents just consuming what we have to offer. We want them to be actively engaged in helping to shape and make decisions. And at the top, although physically we are on the same block, I don't think they all know each other. To get people to know each other, to trust each other, and then to have adequate resources to identify their problems and engage in the resources that they need to address their issues. So I had, these are all pseudonyms of the organizations because anonymity was a condition of the study. They gave multiple reasons, right? They didn't just say one thing. So Nice Neighborhood Organization listed capacity building, advocacy, and service provision as the reasons why they engage. And you can see down the line, all the organizations had some combination of the nine directions, excuse me, the 9 engagement strategies that I shared in the previous slide. So then I wanted to understand what patterns exist within these different strategies and these organizations and their strengths, their nonprofit capacity. So I chose capacity because that was the way I could sort of equalize the better. What makes one organization better than another? You know, we have some organizations that serve 250 people a year and some that serve 84,000 people per year. It would be unfair to compare them without grouping them or putting them in like groups. And using capacity measures was how I did that. So organizations that had within certain budget limits were compared with each other. Organizations that served similar numbers of people were grouped with each other, et cetera. So the mountain of citizen power, I tried to sort of play off of the ladder, and it took me a little while to get to the mountain. There's a little bit of an analogy of climbing in a mountain, which I'll talk about as we go on. But the mountain of power, as opposed to the ladder, or as an alternative to the ladder, identifies 2 kinds of actors: the nonprofits and the citizens, or the people. Citizens are used loosely, not necessarily legal citizens. And this would be the equivalent to Arnstein's haves and have-nots, right? Participation is a power journey. A journey, not necessarily a runged ladder that is linear and doesn't necessarily go in a sequential or way that follows the previous step. It's nonlinear and non-judgmental. The dormant power base at the bottom, capacity building, basic needs, and information sharing, those would probably fall under her non-participation tranche, right? And what this is saying here is that in order to get to the top of a mountain, you need to start at the base, right? I guess if you have a helicopter, you can drop to the top, but that's not really the reality of our communities. So we all start at the base of the mountain, and we go there to put on our sunscreen, stretch, maybe have a snack, get ready for the hike, check out the trail markings to see which direction we want to take. Passive power being sort of the middle tranche: network building, advocacy, political participation. Things get a little bit harder in the middle of a mountain. The ground gets a little bit more shaky, maybe, precarious footing. It's a little bit more difficult. You have to kind of know what you're doing just a little bit. And to get to the top, you really have to be prepared. You have to have the right footwear. You have to go at the right hour. You have to have some kind of insider information. It's rare that you'll just say one day, I'm going to climb Table Mountain and make it to the top without having done any sort of preparation. And that's kind of the idea of power, right? It's not impossible, but for someone to wake up one day and say, I'm going to run to be governor and get there, or I want to organize my entire neighborhood and do it tomorrow, you kind of have to work to it. So I'm making this case that the mountain framework sets up how we understand engagement as a journey. And while active power is the normative goal, it's the peak goal, it's not a universal outcome. Some people may be just fine in the dormant power space. or the passive power space. You might have those diehards that are ready to get to the top of the mountain and they want to run for office or have direct control on local agendas. But that's not everybody's story. And I think what the mountain is also saying is that we meet people where they are. We can't expect everyone to want to get to the top. But we want, as nonprofits, we want to be able to support those that want to get there, and we want to be able to show them the path, right, so to speak, or to give them the tools that they need, should they choose to do that. And from the other side, if we're thinking of it like from funders, we also want to accept that something like providing for basic needs or providing capacity building or sharing information is a legitimate form of engagement. Whereas now I think a lot of funders, government, think about how many community meetings did you hold, how many sign-ins were on the sheet, how many block associations did you start, right? Those are really, I think, outdated forms of how we measure the effectiveness, because we can also doctor those documents or create something that seems like it's working or seems like it's valuable, but it's not really speaking to the needs of the community or the needs of the mission that we're trying to achieve in the actual engagement activity itself. So what did I do? I took did I miss a slide? Sorry, I think I missed a slide here. So basically what I did was I assigned a point value for each of the 3 tranches. So on the bottom of the mountain, if you as an organization listed capacity building, basic needs, and information sharing as your approaches to engagement, each of those would receive 1 point. And I would give the mean of that. So the 3, if they listed the 3 and they each got 1, that would be 3. The mean of that is, the average is just 1. And what I ended up doing was creating the citizen power score. That would be the measure of, the citizen power score is the measure of that simple math that I just did. So for each organization, I'm going to scroll back here quickly. I looked at the engagement approaches that they listed, and then I took the average of it, and I created a scale. From 1 to 3 would be the raw scale, but since the mean of this was 1.81, the actual scale ended up being between, the actual range ended up being between, I believe 1.3 to, I'm looking at it here, sorry, 1.33 to 2.33. As you can see here, Uplift Now Network, their citizen power score was 2.33, and the lowest was, I'm sad I missed that one table that would have made this more clear, 1.33, right? Yeah, so that was the basic range for it. And I created cross tabulations to compare groups of, in this example, budgets relative to their citizen power score. So small budgets were defined as less than 3 million a year, medium 3 to 9, larger than 9 per year. And then I plotted here who fell within which organizations fell within each of those ranges. So the Uplift Now network, where's that one? It is here, the third one down. They scored 2.33 and they had a budget of 1.45 million. So they were in the active power. They were greater than 2 in the small budget here. And I did that for all the organizations. And what that left me with was a pattern to see where there were no hits. And in this case, large organizations, those with budgets more than $9 million a year, did not score in the active power or passive power tranches. And what does that mean functionally? It means that the more money the organizations in my sample had, the lower on the scale they scored. This one is about program capacity. So for this, it's the amount of people served annually was the measure that I chose. And for this one, organizations with a high program capacity, larger than 24,000 people per year, did not score in the active power tranche. So if your main, service is to provide early childhood education and you're serving 10,000 young people a year, what this is suggesting is that there's something to look at, and this isn't a hard sort of statistical, statistically significant, but what it's giving us is an understanding that more people that are served, the less likely they are to be in the active power tranche. And down here, participation style and network capacity. In the literature, I found that when an executive attends a coalition, themselves, not sending a delegate or someone, that it is way more valuable in terms of getting the type of growing the type of network that's important to advancing their own agendas and the collective agenda. So I've had 3 categories here: executives that were part of less than 5 organization coalitions, organizations that were part of 6 to 10 coalitions, and organizations that were larger than 11 coalitions. And what we can see here is that organizations that have the small membership or coalition membership did not score in the active or passive tranche. And then on the other side, the large organizations, the large membership, in coalitions either scored in the active or scored in the dormant ranges. Program capacity, I didn't see any distinctive pattern between those that identified themselves as a social service organization and those that did not identify themselves in a social service organization. And this was surprising to me because I expected that social service organizations would not engage in the active power, because I expect them to be more, again, widgets producing, like, we got to get these metrics done for the grant contracts that we have with the government. But that wasn't the case with my sample. And then org capacity and age. I also thought the older the organization, the more likely they would have active power types of activities. And that wasn't the case here. There seems to be a pretty even split across the age ranges as well as the different power score limits. So implications for scholarship and practice. What the mountain really does is asks us to reframe how we think about the meaning of engagement and what counts as engagement. And I think the first clue I had about this was when I first started my interviews. I had shared my screen and I put a definition of what engagement was. One of the definitions that I included in an earlier slide. And I said, with this definition, tell me what you do in this space. Like, how do you engage people to improve the quality of life, either currently or in the future? And they said, oh, that's not the definition of engagement. And I said, what do you mean? They said, everything we do is engagement. And that's in the basically, this happened twice. They were like, and that's sort of the problem with the industry, is that you don't think that what we're doing is engagement. But when a parent comes to pick up their child from our after school program, we have an opportunity to speak with them and find out what's going on. And they are learning more about us. And that process is building relationships. So they forced me to as a previous grant writer, funder, et cetera, they forced me to rethink how I considered engagement. And that's part of one of the main findings, or one of the main missions, I think, of this work, sort of shifting our understanding of what engagement looks like, so that we can ask scholars to think about it differently, funders and government to think about it differently, and actually make their work a little bit easier in the field, because I think there's a lot of hustling that happens to check the engagement boxes, at least on my side of the Atlantic, so that, because it tends to be a condition of funding, we want you to be, connected to the community. But if we accept the fact that they are connected to the community, and we just support them in those ways, in those different mountain tranches that they're working in, then we can see and understand the gains a little bit differently. The Citizen Power Score, in terms of implications, it can be used as a self-evaluation measure for nonprofits. I think sometimes the work, the nonprofits think, oh, I'm doing engagement at the highest level, I'm active power, and then they can take an inventory of what's actually going on and reflect and say, oh, maybe it's not active power, maybe it's passive power, maybe it's dormant power. And it's not a slight or a shade, but it's sort of a sense of do we want to stay where we're at? Do we want to give folks in our community, in our constituents, greater opportunities to engage? Otherwise, using it just sort of as a point in time count. And also you can use it to compare their approaches across in one organizations across time, or across different organizations, as I did in this study. The Citizen Power Score and the cross-tab analysis can serve as like signposts or trail guides to help nonprofits troubleshoot specific challenges. So if we know that large budgeted organizations tend to be on the dormant power range, then what is it about large amounts of money or funding that pushes organizations away from active or thwarts them or hinders them. If we can even go down that path, understanding the relationship of money or budget size or resource capacity to engagement, understanding what program capacity does to engagement. Serving more people, does that mean we have better chances of active engagement, or are we actually really just stuck in one place? And how do we move that? And then nonprofit capacity addition or contributions and implications. I didn't have network capacity, in my opinion, from my study, was probably the most, the table 9 was probably the most vibrant or the most telling of the findings for me, in that we should support nonprofits' ability to connect with each other more. And that means staff time, truly. That means more resources for them to step away from the work that they do on a day-to-day basis in order to continue to work with other folks who I think are working in silos, because we're all working towards the same things in the community development sector, whether we're doing education or we're doing jobs or we're doing housing. Really, it's the quality of life that we're pushing forward. And if we continue to work in these silos, we're not really supporting the overall mission. We have the ability to tap into other organizations and say, hey, we're organizing against this new power plant that's coming in. I know your organization does this. Do you think any of your folks would want to come here? And that's really the power of network capacity, and how if we focus in a little bit more on supporting that, we might be able to support the larger mission of this journey that I think we're all on together as nonprofits. So I guess overall, engagement is a journey, not a fixed outcome, is sort of the final word that I'll say. And I'm a little bit over, so thank you so much for listening today.
So much, Nakeefa. I've obviously heard the presentation several times. It's still interesting to hear again. And I'm going to be opening up the floor for any questions or comments, including from people online. But I can't help but lead with one. Now that you are here and that you are at the University of Western Cape, is to ask, and you don't have to answer this immediately, you can even wait after the round of questions and comments, is even though you didn't get to do a comparative study, whether you're getting any feedback that's giving you any sense of how this might compare to elsewhere, whether South Africa or elsewhere. So I don't know in the rounds you've been doing, whether you're getting any sense that it resonates or sounds familiar to other people or very different from other contexts. And if you don't know yet, that's fine. There's still time. So maybe just to look around the room, if there are comments, questions, and then online, like I said, feel free to pop up a hand or to put something on the chat and we will attend to you. Rumis, yes, Nati. And please introduce yourselves because obviously that's
sure. My name is Martin.
Hang on.
You tried to attend me earlier.
I startled him.
Just startled me. So as we get the ladder approach, the mountain approach, and compare those two approaches. And for me, what I understood from the ladder approach is that it's sort of it explains to us who holds power at different levels. That's the thing. And I don't know if the mountain does that for us in sort of explaining who holds the power. We understand at the top of the ladder that you know someone is given. I think one of the questions was who's giving the power to these people at these different levels, and whether or not they're interested in moving up that ladder. Because sometimes in certain areas it might be better to actually have a few people have all the power, and then some people sort of are dormant in sort of how they participate. And I think you said something about what the preference is or what the normative thing is. You want people to have all the power in the world. I'm trying to figure out if that's practical and whether that's ideal in every situation.
Right.
And maybe, yeah, I think that's my question.
Yeah, no, I don't think active power is practical in every situation. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that we have an understanding or a framework, or those with power, like funders in government, have an understanding of what power is, that doesn't necessarily play out on the ground. There was a piece that you said earlier, I sort of lost track of your question, but the latter piece, who has the power? So in the mountain, so in Sherry Arnstein's, it's the haves and the have-nots, which are very vague, right? Who are the haves, who are the have-nots? We know who the have-nots are because they're the people that usually are on the receiving end of something. In my framework, the haves are the nonprofits. They have the capacity, they have resources, they have land, they have buildings, they have programs. And the have-nots are the folks, if we want to use a similar, right, I wouldn't call the people of my community have-nots, and I wouldn't call the nonprofits haves, but I'm redefining the relationship here because the power that individuals and low-income communities have access to are through nonprofits, which was part of why I decided to study organizations, nonprofit, community development, nonprofit organizations, because the access to power for community members is limited, right? They can't necessarily just march into City Hall and demand something, right? Chances are they need some sort of alderman or a person that will support or give legitimacy to their standing in that space. And nonprofits tend to be that. Schools can do that, I think. I think in certain venues, hospitals can do that, or certain spaces. And those, I think, in my community, in my city of Newark, those are the two other massive areas of capacity, massive areas of resources where people have access to. So the who, or the who has the power, they're the nonprofits. They are the ones that are trusted by the government and philanthropists to divvy out the piece of the pie, the crumbs of the pie that are given to our communities, and how we are able to mobilize and leverage those crumbs into something is really a function of the nonprofit's capacity and how and what they're able to do, their muscles, their strength. So that was sort of the intention behind those comparisons.
Could you argue though that's the nonprofits having the power is actually just imagined in the sense that like we have seen ever. Because again, so you're telling me that the government is giving them money to do this thing. And so in my head, in that dynamic, the one getting money and resources supposed to hire and so can direct the conversation in the way that they sort of decide.
Sure.
Right. So in that instance, we can now say that the nonprofits and the people sort of benefiting from the nonprofits sort of have the same level of power, as it were.
I wouldn't say that. I would say that the power that nonprofits has is nothing compared to the power that exists. That's for sure. It's probably 20 people in the world that runs everything, right? And I just made that up. That's not a fact. But I was exaggerating to say that none of us really have any true power, but the power that regular people in my community have access to won't necessarily come from City Hall. City Hall is ill-equipped, right? With the devolution that I talked about in the 60s, with the community organizations organizing and the government pulling out, we still had these groups that still transitioned into something and they were trying to maintain their identity as organizers, as community spaces, but we're fighting against these neoliberal ideologies and impositions in terms of how they operated, right? Organizations had to get rid of organizers and hire grant writers because they had to compete for money, right? So you're speaking to a very true fact that, the power here is nothing relative to the power that exists. But in terms of where regular people have the ability to access power, those avenues are limited, particularly in low-income Black and Brown communities in the US, where are we going? Where are we going to have our voices heard? Not the polls. City Hall, sure, we can crowd a local meeting, but in the long term, in the journey that I've described, how do we get people to go from maybe just showing up to take their kid to after school programs, to maybe one day coming to a block party, to maybe one day sitting in on a meeting about clean air, to maybe one day running for something local? And that's not going to be everybody's story, but understanding that we don't just expect people to, like you said, there might be a case where there's a few people with the power in a local setting, and there's a lot of people that don't have power, but we want to be able to give everyone, or at least have organizations have the ability to have folks ascend in a space that they feel comfortable with, that makes sense for them in where they are in their life. Because you have parents, children, elders, retirees with a lot of time. They're all going to participate differently, and the Mountain just sort of tries to account for that part of the journey.
So I'm thinking in relation to my question, whether this might also be one of the areas in terms of the comparative. So I don't know if you noticed the scale of the budgets that Nakeefa is talking about. So the US is a very different, well, I don't think it's very different, but sitting in a very different place now in terms of what the scale of these organizations are to here. So if you can imagine organization, yeah, so if you look at those sort of amounts and even later the scale, we're talking about 3 million and less, that's like a 16 million rand organization. Very few of those, they wouldn't even be called CBOs, those would be like big NGOs in our context. Here also, obviously, we have a Toy culture. So one might actually argue here that the masses on their own have much more voice than organized small CBOs might. I mean, obviously, you've got organized labor and bigger formations, but I don't know whether they have as much resource or power than really communities do. So again, these may be some of the comparatives that could be interesting to look into. But I think appreciating the fact that at a local level, obviously, you're talking at the level of a community, and an organized funded form probably has more access than individual households and their ability to obviously have voice. So thanks for the response. Other comments, questions, reflections on the work? Yes.
Thanks so much. I'm Christine. I work here at the school.
Hi, Christine.
I'm a political theorist by background, which might shape the normative question that I'm trying to get rid of, but it's still lurking. I think it was related to this question of like, where is the state in the mix? I think I'm getting more of it in how we're talking. But yeah, I think it's still a bit blurry to me as to whether we're talking about kind of these NPOs as a mediating kind of force of the power of how the citizen ultimately is engaging with the state, or whether it's the citizens engaging with the NPOs and the extent to which, because when we start with funders want engagement, so how we participate in the community need participation so that we do it justly as equal partners. That's kind of the training I started with. Then towards the end, I started thinking it sounds more like it's also kind of state power decentralized. And I think I have different normative views of those rights. So I think when it's about is the NPO kind of justly serving their aims? Different parts, I can see how distributing the mountain is useful, and all of those tasks are valuable, and there's not like a moral hierarchy of them. But when I'm thinking of like democratic participation and what the state should be structuring as how citizens participate, if it's that being outsourced to NPOs, then I'd be more worried if we're too heavy on the lower end of the scale, for example. Yeah, I don't know.
No, it makes total sense. The role of the state in the literature that grounded this study is that they are the shadow state, right? They are not, and the shadow state is not my term. It's a well-used term in the space, and that means that their heavy hand is not so apparent, and it's very implicit in the technical requirements and the, again, neoliberal ideologies of what the money means or where the money can go. So nonprofits are forced to play ball with the state because that's where a lot of their contracts come from. While at the same time, the government wants engagement. They say they want you as a nonprofit to work with people and not just create agendas on your own. And I think what nonprofits are dealing with now is, even though they're beholden to outcomes and reports and online systems where they have to put in their numbers, the state is, because of the history from the 60s till now, the state is sort of implicit in the way they've been designed over time. It's implicit in the positions that exist, in the way they evaluate themselves, the way they organize their budgets, the way they count success. That all is the state, but the state is not equipped to actually directly connect with people anymore in the United States. That's my opinion, and I think many would agree, because over the last 60 years or so, devolution and outsourcing these roles that the state should be responsible for, like supporting social housing or providing quality education, that's where nonprofits are stepping in to say, well, we don't have access to quality housing. So we are a nonprofit developer. We're going to build housing for our community, or we're going to start our own school. And so they're using, with consent on both sides, I think everybody knows what's happening. They're using the funding from the government to step in and provide those assets, those supports, those resources that the government is unable to provide. And they're unable to provide it, one, because we just don't have the infrastructure. Our agencies don't do that anymore. Of course, we do have like small scale, local municipal recreation departments, but in terms of their, like the Newark Department of Recreation or the Newark Economic Development, they are unable to meet the entire need of the city's residents in the domains that they run. And I would say that it's even the same for the state level and the federal level. So what do? They say, all right, we have this money, we're going to earmark it for the things that we know we have to support. And who has the capacity to do that? Nonprofits, because they actually are in the community. They can reach the people. They have the actual physical infrastructure, like the buildings and the space. And then the government doesn't have to deal with the hiring or the staffing or the technical assistance or the training, et cetera. So where is the state? It's implicit in the way they exist, but it's also, it's implicit in the way the nonprofits exist today. And that's because of the history of devolution. So I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I think the shadow state is where we're at as a nation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's really helpful to think about that the citizen engagement and participation with the state is also in that service delivery
Yes.
space, that's where it's being placed.
Yes.
I'm not sure if that's true yet. I don't work so
Right.
much in the space, but that means if that's where the engagement is happening at the implementation level,
Mm-hmm.
it's good.
Mm-hmm.
But is it happening at any of the policy level questions?
Right.
Would be my
And that's where I think this work is. Sorry, I didn't mean to stop you. No, and that's where I think the work is important, because if we can acknowledge that service delivery is engagement, then now we can hire folks beyond just the person providing the service. We can say we have a social worker as well. We have funding for community organizers that are there when we're giving out the meals after school and there to talk to parents, so that the person that's passing out the food is not the person that's also interacting with the parent, right? We're working in this infrastructure in this engagement resource infrastructure and even the ideology that the shifting and changing, so that nonprofits are getting the support to do, at least on my side, what they're already doing. But they're doing it with a shoestring budget and slapstick, because it's what they have and it's what they know, and it's they're making the best of what they have. So.
But then I can build on that. And I want to make a connection. Half the people in the room are involved with the Civic Tech Innovation Network. And if I think about what we advocate for in a paper that Amy and I wrote, is actually about, in a way, pushing for fund people for what they're already doing, which is the Civic is already innovating. They're already taking on certain functions that are really ought to be state functions. So fund them more. But the risk that I see from some of your findings, I mean, if they were to be generalizable, and if we want to read a lot into the figure you had around the size, the budget relative to the form of engagement, because what that picture is showing is that people who have loads more money are at that lower level of the mountain. And I can't help but wonder if that's not deliberate. So a pattern we already see in civic tech is that a lot of the focus of what innovators in that space do is directed by funders. And they tend to direct them to fund the things they're interested in, which will be here what we call democracy and governance, and not what we'd rather be doing, which is addressing their actual issues.
Right.
And what I'm wondering if we're not seeing here is that you're much more likely to be funded if you're not doing stuff that's really disruptive. So if you're just doing basic capacity building, you're just doing stuff that sounds fine, then we'll give you big bucks. But as soon as you start saying we're funding political revolution, then who's going to fund that? Right. So is that not the possible problem with the model, that on the one hand, yes, it may help, and that's what we're arguing for, is better funding of the work communities are doing for themselves already, but also in a way give that power even more so to the states to decide what they will and won't fund, and soon all of us are just doing what the state wants us to do and not what we think is important.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, that the more money you have, the more people you serve, you sort of become a function of the shadow state. You become a widget maker. And that was what I experienced when I worked in the nonprofit sector. So but also if we're able to say, hey, let's shine a light on this idea that you have so much funding and you could do more. Why aren't you doing more? That's a conversation NGOs are willing to have. Is it because they are actually restricted because of the funding covenants or the funding barrier boundaries? Or are they just so into the Kool-Aid and doing the things that they know how to do to get the money and remain relevant in the eyes of funders? Then that's a different challenge. That's a different, yeah. But that's a really great point. Thank you.
People online, I'm checking to see if your hands are up. I'll stay with the room if I don't see anything. Other comments or questions on the work? I had one comment around the engage versus participate, and it occurs to me it's not something we talked about, but so for me, if I just look at the terms, engage versus participate, I do see a difference in directionality. So to me, engage sounds like somebody engages you in something that I engage you. Whereas participate would mean either direction.
Oh.
And what I link that to, and I don't know if that's true in English, maybe it's my second language, so maybe I don't know. But for me, that's what it sounds like. And I may have referred at one stage to the work of Farah Nakeefa, who writes about invented versus invited spaces for participation. And the idea with the invitation to me sounds like engage. So you can invite people to be, and you can engage people.
Right.
Whereas the invented means I can participate in whatever way I want, whether or not it's you initiating it.
Right.
I can just participate. Does that seem like a potential distinction? Is that something that exists in distinguishing the two, or actually there's not that difference that I'm
the invented versus
the engage versus participate? Because I know you said they're interchangeable, and the literature basically validates your view they're interchangeable. But when I hear them, and as I thought about when you had it up there, I thought, they sound different to me.
No, the words are definitely different. And I think it depends on like the venue, so where it's being used. I know in the field, we talk about resident engagement, but resident engagement doesn't necessarily mean anything in scholarship spaces, right? You might think more about political engagement or community engagement. Resident engagement, when I talk about it with my boss, he's like, that's the first time. He's from Chicago. He's been in Newark for 5 years now. He's like, that must be a Newark thing, or like, that's not something we really use a lot, but that's the main word we use among the practitioners that I connected with. I think that there are some potential definitional distinctions. But for me, coming from as a practitioner and coming and in a way trying to affect the actual local practitioner space, I didn't see that distinction as a valuable one to make or to draw a line around. Because if I had just stuck to one, like participation or engagement, I might be missing the mark on one piece or another from the ground level. And then I might be pegging myself into a space in the literature where I think this work can support advancement in thinking on both sides. But no, they're definitely different terms, different words. You probably hear political participation more than you'll hear political engagement back home. Yeah. I think someone had their hand raised online. Someone's name that started with an M. I thought I saw it.
Oh, I think they're joining.
Oh, okay, sorry.
I'm just looking to see if there are more questions or comments.
Yeah, and about anything like, the Newark or anything, anything else adjacent to the work.
Just on what you're raising in the past about is engagement if I am the one who has the power, like if I am the nonprofit engaging citizens, and I'm now saying, let's engage on this topic that I want, is that a definition of engagement or participation? And again, just repeating this what you're saying, because I don't seem fun as usual. And so participation, again, so is it like any person has the power to set the agenda, right? And so everybody has power in this dynamic. So in my head, participation is all of us have the power to set the agenda, and therefore we have sort of equal power. And engagement is I am the one who holds the funding and the space and resources that you're saying, and therefore I can set the agenda and.
Yeah. I'd say organizations that scored in the active power, they would say, we're not setting the agenda. We want you to set the agenda, community members. We want you to come and tell us what's important to you. Is it the developers that are coming in and building high-rise luxury buildings? Is it your child's education? And then there are some nonprofits that are really just bound by the power that they were given based on the funding and the arenas that they're in. So they are an education provider. So to say that we want to empower or engage folks on something related to environmental justice, sure, it might work, but they probably have limited venues and spaces and times because of their funding and because of their staffing and because of their organizational capacity and their program capacity and all the things. So, I think it's part of the nonprofit challenge that they all want to say, hey, come to the table, tell us what you want to work on. But they also not all of them have the ability to follow through on that. Not all of them have the ability to say, like, if somebody says, hey, we want to work on the ozone layer, some nonprofits might say, hey, we don't know anything about that. We don't have any scientists on board, or that was a really obscure example. Or that's low, right, exactly, or that's not something we care about, and realistically speaking, in terms of our limited budget, time, and our mission. And it also depends on the type of organization. Some organizations are advocacy organizations where they welcome all kinds of conversations, whereas some are housing developers, where there's a little bit more malleability on different community development topics, because housing affects jobs, it affects education, it affects access to healthy foods and green space. So it really depends on the organization and the capacity that they have. So there's a lot of different avenues this research can take, and I'm still kind of decompressing from the dissertation defense and trying to make sense of what the next paper will be, the next direction will be, and the next question that I'll have based on what I found here, how we can make this not relevant, but more useful, because it is a bit theoretical, it is a bit academic, because it's who I am. But I'm also a practitioner. I'm a pracademic is what I like to say. I'm a practitioner, so I want this work to trickle down into a way that, even if it's a piece of it, even if it's a way of thinking, or a conversation about funding, or a conversation about capacity and what that means to engagement, I'm sort of trying to navigate that now.
If there aren't any further questions, perhaps we'll call it there. And the thesis, is it online yet?
No, it'll be online. I embargoed it for a year because I have a paper coming out soon in an edited volume based on and I had to sign like a contract that I wouldn't publish it anywhere else and all the things. So I'm waiting for that, which is in progress now. It's based on this, and then it will automatically be available on the ProQuest library, your databases in June of next year, 2025.
Well, we look forward to the publication.
Yes.
Yeah, just thanks everybody for being here.
Thank
Congrats
you.
again on.
Thank you.
The work.
Thank you for having me. This has been such a great conversation, and I welcome further conversations. I should have put my email address up on the board, but it's my first name, last initial, nbernard@rutgers.edu, NBERNARD@rutgers.edu. Yeah, please, yeah.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Sorry about that.
Oh,
I don't know whether we should share the recording. Is it going to be embargoed because of you?
No.
It's okay.
Yeah, I think we could
And
definitely.
deck?
The slide deck?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can get that.